We live in a time of extraordinary opportunity. Breakthroughs in science, technology, and medicine are curing illnesses and solving problems that prior generations thought impossible to solve. But each day also brings news of growing dangers that threaten everything we cherish and value. Terrorists and extremists have gathered strength and spread to every region of the planet. Rogue regimes represented in this body not only support terrorists, but threaten other nations and their own people with the most destructive weapons known to humanity. Authority and authoritarian powers seek to collapse the values, the systems, and alliances that prevented conflict and tilted the world toward freedom since World War II. International criminal networks traffic drugs, weapons, people, forced dislocation and mass migration, threaten our borders, and new forms of aggression exploit technology to menace our citizens. To put it simply, we meet at a time of both immense promise and great peril. It is entirely up to us whether we lift the world to new heights or let it fall into a valley of disrepair. We have it in our power, should we so choose, to lift millions from poverty, to help our citizens realize their dreams, and to ensure that new generations of children are raised free from violence, hatred, and fear. This institution was founded in the aftermath of 2 world wars to help shape this better future. It was based on the vision that diverse nations could cooperate to protect their sovereignty, preserve their security, and promote their prosperity. It was in the same period, exactly 70 years ago, that the United States developed the Marshall Plan to help restore Europe. Those 3 beautiful pillars, they're pillars of peace, sovereignty, security, and prosperity. The Marshall Plan was built on the noble idea that the whole world is safer when nations are strong, independent, and free. As President Truman said in his message to Congress at that time, our support of European recovery is in full accord with our support of the United Nations. The success of the United Nations depends upon the independent strength of its members. To overcome the perils of the present and to achieve the promise of the future, we must begin with the wisdom of the past. Our success depends on a coalition of strong and independent nations that embrace their sovereignty to promote security, prosperity, and peace for themselves and for the world. We do not expect diverse countries to share the same cultures, traditions, or even systems of government, but we do expect all nations to uphold these 2 core sovereign duties: to respect the interests of their own people and the rights of every other sovereign nation. This is the beautiful vision of this institution, and this is the foundation for cooperation and success. Strong sovereign nations let diverse countries with different values, different cultures, and different dreams not just coexist, but work side by side on the basis of mutual respect. Strong sovereign nations let their people take ownership of the future and control their own destiny. And strong sovereign nations allow individuals to flourish in the fullness of the life intended by God. In America, we do not seek to impose our way of life on anyone, but rather to let it shine as an example for everyone to watch. This week gives our country a special reason to take pride in that example. We are celebrating the 230th anniversary of our beloved Constitution, the oldest Constitution still in use in the world today. This timeless document has been the foundation of peace, prosperity, and freedom for the Americans and for countless millions around the globe whose own countries have found inspiration in its respect for human nature, human dignity, and the rule of law. The greatest in the United States Constitution is its three beautiful words. They are, "We the people." Generations of Americans have sacrificed to maintain the promise of those words, the promise of our country and of our great history. In America, the people govern, the people rule, and the people are sovereign. I was elected not to take power, but to give power to the American people where it belongs. In foreign affairs, we are renewing this founding principle of sovereignty. Our government's first duty is to its people, to our citizens, to serve their needs, to ensure their safety, to preserve their rights, and to defend their values. As President of the United States, I will always put America first, just like you, as the leaders of your countries, will always and should always put your countries first. All responsible leaders have an obligation to serve their own citizens, and the nation-state remains the best vehicle for elevating the human condition. But making a better life for our people also requires us to work together in close harmony and unity to create a more safe and peaceful future for all people. The United States will forever be a great friend to the world, and especially to its allies. But we can no longer be taken advantage of or enter into a one-sided deal where the United States gets nothing in return. As long as I hold this office, I will defend America's interests above all else. But in fulfilling our obligations to our own nations, we also realize that it's in everyone's interest to seek a future where all nations can be sovereign, prosperous, and secure. America does more than speak for the values expressed in the United Nations Charter. Our citizens have paid the ultimate price to defend our freedom and the freedom of many nations represented in this great hall. America's devotion is measured on the battlefields where our young men and women have fought and sacrificed alongside of our allies. From the beaches of Europe to the deserts of the Middle East to the jungles of Asia. It is an eternal credit to the American character that even after we and our allies emerged victorious from the bloodiest war in history, we did not seek territorial expansion or attempt to oppose and impose our way of life on others. Instead, we helped build institutions such as this one to defend the sovereignty, security, and prosperity for all. For the diverse nations of the world, this is our hope. We want harmony and friendship, not conflict and strife. We are guided by outcomes, not ideology. We have a policy of principled realism rooted in shared goals, interests, and values. That realism forces us to confront a question facing every leader and nation in this room. It is a question we cannot escape or avoid. We will slide down the path of complacency, numb to the challenges, threats, and even wars that we face? Or do we have enough strength and pride to confront those dangers today so that our citizens can enjoy peace and prosperity tomorrow? If we desire to lift up our citizens, if we aspire to the approval of history, then we must fulfill our sovereign duties to the people we faithfully represent. We must protect our nations, their interests, and their futures. We must reject threats to sovereignty from the Ukraine to the South China Sea. We must uphold respect for law, respect for borders, and respect for culture, and the peaceful engagement these allow. And just as the founders of this body intended, we must work together and confront together those who threaten us with chaos, turmoil, and terror. The scourge of our planet today is a small group of rogue regimes that violate every principle on which the United Nations is based. They respect neither their own citizens nor the sovereign rights of their countries. If the righteous many do not confront the wicked few, then evil will triumph. When decent people and nations become bystanders to history, the forces of destruction only gather power and strength. No one has shown more contempt for other nations and for the well-being of their own people than the depraved regime in North Korea. It is responsible for the starvation deaths of millions of North Koreans and for the imprisonment, torture, killing, and oppression of countless more. We were all witness to the regime's deadly abuse when an innocent American college student, Otto Warmbier, was returned to America only to die a few days later. We saw it in the assassination of the dictator's brother using banned nerve agents in an international airport. We know it kidnapped a sweet 13-year-old Japanese girl from a beach in her own country to enslave her as a language tutor for North Korea's spies. If this is not twisted enough, now North Korea's reckless pursuit of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles threatens the entire world with unthinkable loss of human life. It is an outrage that some nations would not only trade with such a regime, but would arm, supply, and financially support a country that imperils the world with nuclear conflict. No nation on earth has an interest in seeing this band of criminals arm itself with nuclear weapons and missiles. The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime. The United States is ready, willing, and able, but hopefully this will not be necessary. That's what the United Nations is all about. That's what the United Nations is for. Let's see how they do. It is time for North Korea to realize that the denuclearization is its only acceptable future. The United Nations Security Council recently held 2 unanimous 15-0 votes adopting hard-hitting resolutions against North Korea, and I want to thank China and Russia for joining the vote to impose sanctions along with all of the other members of the Security Council. Thank you to all involved. But we must do much more. It is time for all nations to work together to isolate the Kim regime until it ceases its hostile behavior. We face this decision not only in North Korea. It is far past time for the nations of the world to confront another reckless regime, one that speaks openly of mass murder, vowing death to America, destruction to Israel, and ruin for many leaders and nations in this room. The Iranian government masks a corrupt dictatorship behind the false guise of a democracy. It has turned a wealthy country with a rich history and culture into an economically depleted rogue state whose chief exports are violence, bloodshed, and chaos. The longest suffering victims of Iran's leaders are, in fact, its own people. Rather than use its resources to improve Iranian lives, its oil profits go to fund Hezbollah and other terrorists that kill innocent Muslims and attack their peaceful Arab and Israeli neighbors. This wealth, which rightly belongs to Iran's people, also goes to shore up Bashar al-Assad's dictatorship, fuel Yemen's civil war, and undermine peace throughout the entire Middle East. We cannot let a murderous regime continue these destabilizing activities while building dangerous missiles, and we cannot abide by an agreement if it provides cover for the eventual construction of a nuclear program. The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into. Frankly, that deal is an embarrassment to the United States, and I don't think you've heard the last of it, believe me. It is time for the entire world to join us in demanding that Iran's government end its pursuit of death and destruction. It is time for the regime to free all Americans and citizens of other nations that they have unjustly detained. And above all, Iran's government must stop supporting terrorists, begin serving its own people, and respect the sovereign rights of its neighbors. The entire world understands that the good people of Iran want change. And other than the vast military power of the United States, that Iran's people are what their leaders fear the most. This is what causes the regime to restrict internet access, tear down satellite dishes, shoot unarmed student protesters, and imprison political reformers. Oppressive regimes cannot endure forever, and the day will come when the people will face a choice. Will they continue down the path of poverty, bloodshed, and terror, or will the Iranian people return to the nation's proud roots as a center of civilization, culture, and wealth, where their people can be happy and prosperous once again? The Iranian regime's support for terror is in stark contrast to the recent commitments of many of its neighbors to fight terrorism and halt its financing. In Saudi Arabia early last year, I was greatly honored to address the leaders of more than 50 Arab and Muslim nations. We agreed that all responsible nations must work together to confront terrorists and the Islamic extremism that inspires them. We will stop radical Islamic terrorism because we cannot allow it to tear up our nation and indeed to tear up the entire world. We must deny the terrorists safe haven, transit, funding, and any form of support for their vile and sinister ideology. We must drive them out of our nations. It is time to expose and hold responsible those countries who support and finance terror groups like Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, the Taliban, and others that slaughter innocent people. The United States and our allies are working together throughout the Middle East to crush the loser terrorists and stop the reemergence of safe havens they use to launch attacks on all of our people. Last month, I announced a new strategy for victory in the fight against this evil in Afghanistan. From now on, our security interests will dictate the length and scope of military operations, not arbitrary benchmarks and timetables set up by politicians. I have also totally changed the rules of engagement in our fight against the Taliban and other terrorist groups. In Syria and Iraq, we have made big gains toward lasting defeat of ISIS. In fact, our country has achieved more against ISIS in the last 8 months than it has in many, many years combined. We seek the de-escalation of the Syrian conflict and a political solution that honors the will of the Syrian people. The actions of the criminal regime of Bashar al-Assad, including the use of chemical weapons against his own citizens, even innocent children, shock the conscience of every decent person. No society can be safe if banned chemical weapons are allowed to spread. That is why the United States carried out a missile strike on the airbase that launched the attack. We appreciate the efforts of the United Nations agencies that are providing vital humanitarian assistance in areas liberated from ISIS, and we especially thank Jordan, Turkey, and Lebanon for their role in hosting refugees from the Syrian conflict. The United States is a compassionate nation and has spent billions and billions of dollars in helping to support this effort. We seek an approach to refugee resettlement that is designed to help these horribly treated people and which enables their eventual return to their home countries to be part of the rebuilding process. For the cost of resettling one refugee in the United States, we can assist more than 10 in their home region. Out of the goodness of our hearts, we offer financial assistance to hosting countries in the region, and we support recent agreements of the G20 nations that will seek to host refugees as close to their home countries as possible. This is the safe, responsible, and humanitarian approach. For decades, the United States has dealt with migration challenges here in the Western Hemisphere. We have learned that over the long term, uncontrolled migration is deeply unfair to both the sending and the receiving countries. For the sending countries, it reduces domestic pressure to pursue needed political and economic reform and drains them of the human capital necessary to motivate and implement those reforms. For the receiving countries, the substantial costs of uncontrolled migration are borne overwhelmingly by low-income citizens whose concerns are often ignored by both media and government. I want to salute the work of the United Nations in seeking to address the problems that cause people to flee from their homes. The United Nations and African Union led peacekeeping missions to have invaluable contributions in stabilizing conflicts in Africa. the United States continues to lead the world in humanitarian assistance, including famine prevention and relief in South Sudan, Somalia, and northern Nigeria and Yemen. We have invested in better health and opportunity all over the world through programs like PEPFAR, which funds AIDS relief, the President's Malaria Initiative, the Global Health Security Agenda, the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, and the Woman Entrepreneurs Finance Initiative, part of our commitment to empowering women all across the globe. We also thank the Secretary General for recognizing that the United Nations must reform if it is to be an effective partner in confronting threats to sovereignty, security, and prosperity. Too often, the focus of this organization has not been on results, but on bureaucracy and process. In some cases, states that seek to subvert this institution's noble aims have hijacked the very systems that are supposed to advance them. For example, it is a massive source of embarrassment to the United Nations that some governments with egregious human rights records sit on the UN Human Rights Council. The United States is one out of 193 countries in the United Nations, and yet we pay 22% of the entire budget and more. In fact, we pay far more than anybody realizes. The United States bears an unfair cost burden, but to be fair, if it could actually accomplish all of its stated goals, especially the goal of peace, this investment would easily be well worth it. Major portions of the world are in conflict, and some, in fact, are going to hell. But the powerful people in this room, under the guidance and auspices of the United Nations, can solve many of these vicious and complex problems. The American people hope that one day soon the United Nations can be a much more accountable and effective advocate for human dignity and freedom around the world. In the meantime, we believe that no nation should have to bear a disproportionate share of the burden, militarily or financially. Nations of the world must take a greater role in promoting secure and prosperous societies in their own regions. That is why in the Western Hemisphere, the United States has stood against the corrupt, destabilizing regime in Cuba and embraced the enduring dream of the Cuban people to live in freedom. My administration recently announced that we will not lift sanctions on the Cuban government until it makes fundamental reforms. We have also imposed tough, calibrated sanctions on the socialist Maduro regime in Venezuela, which has brought a once thriving nation to the brink of total collapse. The socialist dictatorship of Nicolas Maduro has inflicted terrible pain and suffering on the good people of that country. This corrupt regime destroyed a prosperous nation by imposing a failed ideology that has produced poverty and misery everywhere it has been tried. To make matters worse, Maduro has defied his own people, stealing power from their elected representatives to preserve his disastrous rule. The Venezuelan people are starving, and their country is collapsing. Their democratic institutions are being destroyed. This situation is completely unacceptable, and we cannot stand by and watch. As a responsible neighbor and friend, we and all others have a goal. That goal is to help them regain their freedom, recover their country, and restore their democracy. I would like to thank leaders in this room for condemning the regime and providing vital support to the Venezuelan people. The United States has taken important steps to hold the regime accountable. We are prepared to take further action if the government of Venezuela persists on its path to impose authoritarian rule on the Venezuelan people. We are fortunate to have incredibly strong and healthy trade relationships with many of the Latin American countries gathered here today. Our economic bond forms a critical foundation for advancing peace and prosperity for all of our people and all of our neighbors. I ask every country represented here today to be prepared to do more to address this very real crisis. We call for the full restoration of democracy and political freedoms in Venezuela. The problem in Venezuela is not that socialism has been poorly implemented, but that socialism has been faithfully implemented. From the Soviet Union to Cuba to Venezuela, wherever true socialism or communism has been adopted, it has delivered anguish and devastation and failure. Those who preach the tenets of these discredited ideologies only contribute to the continued suffering of the people who live under these cruel systems. America stands with every person living under a brutal regime. Our respect for sovereignty is also a call for action. All people deserve a government that cares for their safety, their interests, and their prosperity. In America, we seek stronger ties of business and trade with all nations of goodwill. But this trade must be fair and it must be reciprocal. For too long, the American people were told that mammoth multinational trade deals, unaccountable international tribunals, and powerful global bureaucracies were the best way to promote their success. But as those promises flowed, millions of jobs vanished and thousands of factories disappeared. Others gamed the system and broke the rules. And our great middle class, once the bedrock of American prosperity, was forgotten and left behind. But they are forgotten no more, and they will never be forgotten again. While America will pursue cooperation and commerce with other nations, we are renewing our commitment to the first duty of every government, the duty of our citizens. This bond is the source of America's strength and that of every responsible nation represented here today. If this organization is to have any hope of successfully confronting the challenges before us, it will depend, as President Truman said some 70 years ago, on the independent strength of its members. If we are to embrace the opportunities of the future and overcome the present dangers together, there can be no substitute for strong, sovereign, and independent nations. Nations that are rooted in their histories and invested in their destinies. Nations that seek allies to befriend, not enemies to conquer. And most important of all, nations that are home to patriots, to men and women who are willing to sacrifice for their countries, their fellow citizens, and for all that is best in the human spirit. In remembering the great victory that led to this body's founding, we must never forget that those heroes who fought against evil also fought for the nations that they loved. Patriotism led the Poles to die to save Poland, the French to fight for a free France, and the Brits to stand strong for Britain. Today, if we do not invest ourselves, our hearts, and our minds in our nations, if we will not build strong families, safe communities, and healthy societies for ourselves, no one can do it for us. We cannot wait for someone else, for faraway countries or far-off bureaucracies. We can't do it. We must solve our problems to build our prosperity, to secure our future, or we will build vulnerable to decay, domination, and defeat. The true question for the United Nations today, for people all over the world who hope for better lives for themselves and their children, is a basic one. Are we still patriots? Do we love our nations enough to protect their sovereignty and to take ownership of their futures? Do we revere them enough to defend their interests, preserve their cultures, and ensure a peaceful world for their citizens? One of the greatest American patriots, John Adams, wrote that the American Revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people. That was the moment when America awoke, when we looked around and understood that we were a nation. We realized who we were, what we valued, and what we would give our lives to defend. From its very first moments, the American story is the story of what is possible when people take ownership of their future. The United States of America has been among the greatest forces for good in the history of the world, and the greatest defenders of sovereignty, security, and prosperity for all. Now we are calling for a great reawakening of nations, for the revival of their spirits, their pride, their people, and their patriotism. History is asking us whether we are up to the task. Our answer will be a renewal of will, a rediscovery of resolve, and a rebirth of devotion we need to defeat the enemies of humanity and unlock the potential of life itself. Our hope is a word and world of proud, independent nations that embrace their duties, seek friendship, respect others, and make common cause in the greatest shared interest of all, a future of dignity and peace for the people of this wonderful earth. This is the true vision of the United Nations, the ancient wish of every people, and the deepest yearning that lives inside every sacred soul. So let this be our mission, and let this be our message to the world. We will fight together, sacrifice together, and stand together for peace, for freedom, for justice, for family, for humanity, and for the Almighty God who made us all. Thank you. God bless you. God bless the nations of the world, and God bless the United States of America. Thank you very much.
All right, there you have it. U.S. President Donald Trump delivering his maiden address at the UN General Assembly, talking about a lot of points over there, from the threat from North Korea to Iran's nuclear program. And he also talked about the unfair cost goals of the United Nations, hinting at possible reforms that United States may be looking at this point in time. So that was the address, about 45 minutes that the U.S. President Donald Trump gave out at the Assembly. It was a carefully scripted address, and Donald Trump, the U.S. President, didn't seem to deviate from that script. He stuck to what he had to say. The harshest words for North Korea that he used, he said that the world wants peace, but ultimately, if North Korea does not pay heed to what the international community is saying, that ultimately the U.S. will be left with no other choice but to completely destroy North Korea. Those are the words of the U.S. President Donald Trump. Nothing on climate change, though, but he did manage to talk about various other issues. He talked about the threats to sovereignty. He said, and I quote, "We must protect our nation's their interests and their futures. We must reject threats to sovereignty from the Ukraine to the South China Sea." He also said that we can no longer be taken advantage of. Some of the key points that he spoke about was, of course, the address on North Korea, where he called the North Korean regime a depraved regime, saying that they are responsible for the starvation and deaths of millions and for imprisonment, torture and oppression of countless more. He also, in fact, touched upon the case of the American student Otto Warmbier, who was in North Korea and died a few days after returning to the United States. He said their reckless pursuit of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles threatened the entire world with unthinkable loss of human life. This while addressing the tensions in the Korean Peninsula. In fact, he also warned North Korea. He, in fact, called Korean regime a band of criminals and said that the U.S. had great patience, but that later on America will be left with no choice but to totally destroy North Korea if they continue with their provocations. All right, let me go across to WION senior correspondent Ramesh Ramachandran. He joins me from the newsroom. WION senior foreign editor Padma Rao is with me here in the studio. Ramesh, coming to you first. Donald Trump there sticking to scripted speech, which he was, of course, reading off from the teleprompter and did not deviate. No shockers, no surprises, so to speak.
Indeed, in a sense, this was an interesting debut speech, Sana, by the U.S. President Donald Trump at the UNG, the 72nd session in New York. But just to give viewers a flavor of what he essentially said, he touched upon North Korea, expected. He touched upon Iran, expected. He touched upon Venezuela, expected. He also touched upon other countries in the region and beyond. But to my mind, from India's perspective in particular, and a South Asian perspective, he spoke about the threats posed by terrorism, and he specifically mentioned that he will act against those countries who are giving safe havens to organizations such as the Taliban in particular, and that, to my mind, could be seen as an indirect reference to Pakistan and its complicity in fomenting violence in the region and beyond. And also on the South China Sea issue, Sana, he categorically mentioned that countries must respect law and must respect borders when he spoke about from Ukraine to South China Sea. And that, to my mind, is a direct reference to China's so-called peaceful rise in South China Sea, in particular, which has antagonized neighbors such as Philippines and Vietnam, among others.
All right, let me go to Padma now. Padma, what do you have to say about Donald Trump's address? Was it on expected lines? A lot of things that we were talking about that he will talk about, he did. Any surprises according to you?
Well, I wouldn't call it a surprise, but I certainly found it to be a very unusual ingredient of his speech. You know, he was, right from the beginning, he said it several times, he stressed upon each country of the United Nations developing its independent strength. He said it once, he said it twice, he said it several times. And towards the end of his speech, he also spoke about each country should defend its interests, should preserve its culture. He talked about revival of patriotism and pride. He also said the Brits should be doing everything they can for the British France should be doing everything for the French. This was a very significant, stance for me, because it showed really that it almost reflected his kind of the United States President advocating the rise of nationalism, greater national pride, if you will, right, in all these countries. And the two countries he referred to, of course, he referred to Britain, where Brexit has just happened, and he also referred to France, where there's been a series of terrorist incidents, predominantly by refugees and people who've come to France from the outside. So I think what he was also referring to was the European Union's tendency, to have this pursue policies which are based on human rights violations and based on asylum, and these are policies which have got the European Union all twisted in knots over how to tackle the terrorism issue. So to me that certainly stood out in his speech.
Okay, there were hints, in fact, just for our viewers, we were talking about this earlier as well, that Donald Trump might bring in America first, the policy that he has always been advocated, but then talking about global cooperation as well. Perhaps that was what he was trying to do. Raymond E. Vickery, junior former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce, Trade Development, author and advice on U.S.-India relations, is also live with us from Washington. Mr. Vickery, thanks so much for joining us. Did you think that Donald Trump's address was more or less on the expected lines, that he spoke in measured tones and not went off the rails? He stuck to the script.
Yes, I think that it was better than most. It's pretty apparent that there are two Donald Trump policies, one which is on the Twitter and when he ad-libs, and another when you have a vetted, serious kind of speech. That having been said, it seems to me the most remarkable turnaround in this speech is going from the Donald Trump of the Twitter and the campaign rallies decrying the United Nations, saying that really basically it was useless, to a posture of saying, yes, the United Nations really could be the hope of the world and that we all had to pull together. So that seriously is progress. On other matters, the idea of sovereignty is all well and good. The question is not one of sovereignty. The question is what you do to be able to get to these goals. And in that regard, I don't know that the speech itself gives you any way to get to peace in Northeast Asia with North Korea, nor does it give you a way to get to peace in regard to Iran. It was remarkable to me that he did again talk about his policy of no sanctuaries for terrorism in Pakistan. I think that message has to be received loudly and clearly.
Mr. Raymond Vickery, Padma and Ramesh, do stay with me. It's important to go back and listen into that exact excerpt when the US President spoke about North Korea and what his plans are for the regime.
Now North Korea's reckless pursuit of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles threatens the entire world with unthinkable loss of human life. It is an outrage that some nations would not only trade with such a regime, but would arm, supply, and financially support a country that imperils the world with nuclear conflict. No nation on earth has an interest in seeing this band of criminals arm itself with nuclear weapons and missiles. The United States has great strength and patience. But if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea.
Once again, Mr. Raymond Vickery, I want to go back to you, asking you about what you thought about the way Donald Trump, the U.S. President, how he addressed the issue of North Korea. One could have expected that he'd go with a more unilateral approach, having tried very hard, to convince Russia and China and to adopt a unilateral approach. Do you see this as a continuation of what he's been saying all along?
Well, no, I really don't. I mean, he thanked China and Russia publicly. He called on other nations. I did find it unnecessary to repeat the business about he would destroy North Korea. If we get into a war, India loses, the U.S. loses, the whole world loses. The question is not whether North Korea should change its ways and become a part of the community of nations. The question is, how do you preserve peace and how do you get North Korea to that? And I would say that India has a very great stake in this. You may recall that in the early 2000s, the reports about trade between Pakistan and North Korea in regard to missile technology, in regard to nuclear technology. This is not something that any nation can stand aside from and say, well, we've got no dog in that fight, as we say in the southern United States. Right. What we have to do is look together at how we can do it.
All right. Padma, coming to you, would you add to that how India should be looking at it? Because India has also taken a tough stance on North Korea, asking to look into the links between Pyongyang and Islamabad as well. So it then reiterates the fact that all the countries are together, united in terms of dealing with this threat in the Korean Peninsula.
Certainly, I think India is very much, behind the United States, or at least the stand taken by the United States and by various other countries. In fact, the majority of countries today have taken that very firm stance against North Korea. Especially, it's firing rockets and missiles over Japan's territory and various other threats emanating from Pyongyang. However, I think the approach is likely to be different, and I certainly agree with Ray that if North Korea if there's a war, then everyone's going to be affected, including and especially India, because we are much closer to North Korea. So certainly there will be, that is a separate issue altogether, and let's hope that things don't go down that road. But as far as the approach to North Korea is concerned, I think India will continue to maintain its own sovereign approach, in the sense it's not going to keel under any kind of external pressure to say cut off diplomatic relations entirely or cut off trade, although the trade relations between the two countries at $60 million, more to the advantage of North Korea than to India. So that's not going to really, be a big disadvantage for India. But I think India will prefer, as it has always done in its foreign policy, to maintain its own, to make up its own mind as to how it's eventually going to deal with North Korea. But that North Korea needs to be dealt with. That, I think, is the common meeting ground between the United States, between India and various other countries, especially in the light of the fact that the United States, Japan, India and perhaps eventually Australia are increasingly becoming strategic partners in the region, in the larger maritime region. And if earlier China was seen as the main security threat perception, then now it certainly includes all the more so North Korea.
All right. In fact, Ramesh, if I can come to you, anything you would like to add at this point before we move ahead? Because Donald Trump also spoke about hinting at UN reforms as well, something that we were talking about. Also, do you think that reducing the size of the American entourage this time will have any effect on the way America goes ahead and portrays itself at the world stage, at the UN General Assembly? Many have been talking about the fact that the entourage is much smaller this time, and that could perhaps impact the way things move ahead.
Well, clearly from what we just heard from President Trump's speech there at the UNGA, Sana, I can make two quick inferences. One, clearly the big departure from previous years' speeches by the American president at the UNGA is Trump's emphasis on America first. He's talking about American people, American companies, American money, American investments, American interests, and that, to my mind, would be the lead motive for the Trump administration over the next 3 years or more. Number one. Number two, I was contrasting his speech with that of Obama's debut speech in 2009 at the UNGA, when if you go through the thrust of Obama's arguments at that time, Sana, his focus was more on multilateralism. His focus was more on removing the anti-Americanism prevalent at that time. also on economic crisis, on climate change, on disrupting, dismantling and defeating the Al-Qaeda. And he also spoke about how he has wound up the war in Iraq. And to my mind, this poses a complete study in contrast with the Trump speech and the emphasis in Trump's speech, especially in light of the economic situation, the security situation appearing in countries around the world. That, to my mind, is the big takeaway from Trump's speech insofar as Iran, North Korea, Syria and Venezuela go.
All right. Please stay with me, all of you. Let's play out a couple of more excerpts from the U.S. President's speech at the UNGA. He spoke about terrorism, he spoke about Iran and a few other subjects. Let's try and listen in.
We will stop radical Islamic terrorism because we cannot allow it to tear up our nation and indeed to tear up the entire world. We must deny the terrorists safe haven, transit, funding, and any form of support for their vile and sinister ideology. We must drive them out of our nations. The Iranian government masks a corrupt dictatorship behind the false guise of a democracy. It has turned a wealthy country with a rich history and culture into an economically depleted rogue state whose chief exports are violence, bloodshed, and chaos. The longest suffering victims of Iran's leaders are, in fact, its own people.
All right, let me first quickly go across to WION Senior Foreign Editor Padma Rao, who's with me here in the studio. Padma, there are a lot of topics that Donald Trump touched upon, but any of the things that you feel that he might have not said or missed out or left unsaid?
Well, I certainly think, the Security Council reforms, I personally didn't expect him to raise Pakistan for all the usual reasons. No American president, as long as he needs Pakistan, is going to stand in the General Assembly of the United Nations and slam Pakistan by naming it. So I didn't expect that. But I certainly expected him, especially since he's placing so many expectations in the United Nations, to have touched upon the very crucial question of reforms. Because the United Nations, as President Trump himself and his administration have repeatedly said, and so have previous administrations in the United States, the United Nations has become, over the 70 years of its existence, a bloated and over-bloated organization. There's such a lot of dead wood that needs to be chopped. And most essentially, the Security Council no longer reflects the realities of the world today. And we're certainly we've been talking about a membership with a veto right. We're not just satisfied with rotational membership and all the other, toffees that have been offered to India over the years. Now, he did not touch upon that. And I was also a little surprised and a little amused to see that, when he talked about the usual suspects, Iran, Syria, North Korea, and, the only thing he did is to bring Venezuela down to the bottom of that list. But he didn't mention the fact, or didn't even sort of comment on the fact that President Maduro has, has made some sort of overtures towards the opposition that there will be talks and they will commence talks. And the irony is, he also made a joke, President Trump, about how socialism has really, been implemented successfully in Venezuela. But I couldn't, help thinking that there are so many things wrong with China's brand of totalitarian government, with China's brand of socialism, if you like, which never find mention, didn't find mention in his speech either. So these are the two things that struck me as particularly.
Mr. Vikri, also, Donald Trump, he's known to have slammed the United Nations on many occasions, especially during the time that he campaigned for the presidential election back in 2016. He's called it an underperformer, a club for people to get together, talk and have a good time, and, a lot of other terms that he's used for the United Nations. Having, looked at that, he was pretty serious today when it came to his address. Do you think he made mostly the right kind of noises to get world attention?
Well, I think it was certainly better. I mean, of course, that isn't a very high bar for him. because this business of creating policy by Twitter and going before your supporters and revving them up about a wall and how immigrants are destroying the nation and so forth. So it's not a very high bar, but he certainly did do better. He certainly stuck to what was on the teleprompter and what had been written out. So that's all to the good. I think that one of the things that bothers me about the speech is that the speech was overwhelmingly militarily oriented. It had to do with military means and what happens with bombs and guns, and the lack of understanding of the relationship, economic engagement, on the environment, what happens with the parents, what happens with the transit. And disconnect in our own talks about the first plan.
Right.
Fact,
Mr. Vikri, I get most of what you're saying, but this last bit, I think your voice is breaking. We'll have to check the connection, the internet connection over there. I'll come back to you in just a bit, but Ramesh, at this point, I'd like to come to you. Now, Donald Trump, as expected, he went on to talk about the America First policy, and this also, comes at a time when we also hear relaxations and the process being sped up as far as the H-1B work visas are concerned. So what does one make of what Donald Trump is thinking? He is talking about two extreme things at the same time: sovereignty, America first, but then international cooperation as well in the same address.
Well, Sana, clearly when Donald Trump speaks of America first, it goes without saying that he is turning America isolationist, protectionist, inward-looking, and he is not a great votary of free trade, and that is why we're seeing his position on the H-1B visa issue, for instance. He sees it from the realm or rubric of trade, not necessarily an issue of mobility or freedom of movement of workers from one country to another. And that, to my mind, is a fundamental difference between India and the US on the issue of H-1B visa in particular. But that said, and we also saw Trump, position on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, from which he pulled the US out, just as he pulled the US out of the climate change accord that reached at Paris. So clearly, we are seeing a new American protectionism at display here at the UNG and also at multiple locations around the world. Just to quickly come back to the point Raymond Vikri was making there, Sana, when he talked about a overt military symbolism or emphasis on military approach in his speech. I was intrigued because in 2009, Sana, for instance, when Obama began his tenure, he spoke about problem areas, namely Iran and Cuba, among others. And towards the end of his presidency, we saw him come around to opening a dialogue with both Iran and Cuba. And in a similar vein, I'm just wondering, listening to Trump's speak at the UNGA, for instance, he spoke about Venezuela, he spoke about North Korea, and I'm just wondering,
also Cuba.
Towards the end of his presidency, should we or can we see Trump coming around to the view that talks and dialogue is the only way forward insofar as Venezuela and North Korea is concerned? And can we see him do another Obama insofar as these countries are concerned?
It'll be interesting to quickly take a reaction from Raymond Vikri on this. I believe the connection is good again. Mr. Vikri, would you agree with what Ramesh is saying? Presidents come and they have their agenda, but things change over a period of time and the policies could change. Do you see that happening? Donald Trump, he still has time in office.
Well, it's already changed. I mean, it's been a sea change in regard to the United Nations. It's been a sea change in terms of whether or not the United States could do everything alone. When he started out with North Korea, he thought that he could accomplish it all by threatening people. So there has been change. The question is, will the change be fast enough to keep the peace, to be able to solve problems, and have a peaceful and prosperous world? And I think the jury is really still out on that. And I am very afraid, as I'm sure people are around the world, that the learning curve will be too steep for the man, because we do not know what the principles are. We do not know how to get consistency out of this. We don't even have the domestic activities that would back up the tendency toward learning about how to work with other people.
Right. Padma Rao here in the studio. Padma, do you have something to add to what we are talking about? Any points that we might have missed out till now?
Yeah, well, two things, unrelated, both of them, both from his speech. He took a couple of digs President Trump did at President Obama. He talked about the policy in Afghanistan, what it was before, setting timelines, and that he's not going to go down that road again. I thought there was quite a bit of, not quite a bit, but there was some amount of washing of dirty linen, which is basically domestic politics, U.S. domestic politics, which he brought to the United Nations. And I thought that was very unusual because normally, I mean, at least, most Indian politicians, we squabble like anything within our own parliament in India. But when you're actually on a world stage, you don't very often see, in fact, I don't think I've ever seen a prime minister actually, criticize the opposition back home in India. I mean, yes, I saw Mr. Rahul Gandhi do that in Berkeley recently, but then that was a different forum, and it was really a departure. I haven't seen much of that. So that was very unusual, but again, not unexpected, being President Trump. And the other thing I thought is that, I had opportunity to think while we lost Ray Vickery about and the sea change in President Trump's approach to the United Nations. And I think it may have something to do with the fact that, there are, I mean, let's not forget the UN Permanent Representative Nikki Haley's speech. Ambassador Nikki Haley, first listed all the sanctions that had not worked against North Korea, and then finally said we are going to now impose even tougher sanctions. And then, now that they have China and Russia on board, they're going to try a combination of tough sanctions as well as negotiations and talks, direct talks with the North Korean regime. This is now the second thing that they're trying.
Right.
But if that fails, Sana, there is an option within the United Nations Security Council that if all else fails and there is a rogue state or a so-called rogue state, one that's being seen as a rogue state, that the United Nations has the authority to sanction military action by any given member state. So, I think this might be this sort of being nice to the United Nations and this whole new relationship that President Trump is building with the UN might have a lot to do, and in that I agree with Ray Vickery. He did talk a lot about military action,
right.
That they might be actually looking for that kind of support, the larger moral support, if you will, the stamp of approval, the kosher stamp, if you will, from the United Nations for anything that the United States might be planning, either unilaterally or multilaterally, against North Korea.
Right. In fact, just to talk a bit about Iran's nuclear deal, Mr. Vickery, and what the US President had to say about that, do you think he approached it a little bit better, laying the blame on Iranians, but not directly saying anything about what he'll do with this nuclear deal? In that sense, do you think he saved himself the embarrassment of angering his other allies as far as the UK, France, Germany and others go in this case? Or do you think he could have handled it a little better?
Well, I think he could have handled it better. It seems to me that he wanted to continue the campaign line of it's the worst deal ever, and sort of a sellout kind of a situation. He did moderate somewhat, but everyone who really has looked at this situation knows that the alternative to this deal really is military action. And that really is what we've got to try to get around. Military action, whether it be against Iran or North Korea, is a road to disaster. And so how do you do this? And you don't do it necessarily by just insulting. Now, I agree, of course, that the Iran situation is still bad. But we have to have as a first approach, how do we get from here to there in terms of what the problems are? And in that regard, other than that we're going to be tough and belligerent and so forth, I didn't see any indication that he had any better solution. And I don't think he does. And I think that's the reason that in spite of all the rhetoric, he has basically beat them.
All right. In fact, Ramesh, coming to you, would you agree with what Mr. Vikri is saying, that, you know, it's a careful line that Donald Trump has to adopt, at the same time not angering US's partners in the Iran deal, because giving up on Iran's nuclear deal would definitely mean a bigger challenge as far as dealing with the North is concerned. Then the chances of negotiations and talks will be far less in case he were to go back on the nuclear deal immediately in a shot.
Indeed, I mean, this has been the central theme in his speech at the UNGA. Sana, he spoke about how the rogue state or the corrupt dictatorship in Iran in particular was exporting violence in the region and beyond. And that, to my mind, is the fundamental problem which the Trump administration has with the Iran nuclear deal. He's using carefully chosen words that the deal is an embarrassment for the US and that it should not become a cover for a nuclear weapons program. And to my mind, the crucial aspect when you referred to the rogue regime was the righteous should confront the wicked few and not just remain bystanders. And just to take off the point where Mr. Vikri left, this overt messianic zeal, in a sense, when he speaks about the righteous and the wicked few, to my mind, could pose a danger to many countries in the region and beyond, especially the question marks over America's leadership on the global stage. There's an inherent contradiction in terms when you talk about America first and America's leadership on world or global crises that confront the countries of the world. And that, to my mind, has to be resolved going forward.
All right. Once again, if I can please request all of you to please stay with me. Let's go back and listen in to some of the highlights of the U.S. President's address at the UN General Assembly a short while back.
Should have to bear a disproportionate share of the burden, militarily or financially. Nations of the world must take a greater role in promoting secure and prosperous societies in their own regions. That is why in the Western Hemisphere, the United States has stood against the corrupt, destabilizing regime in Cuba and embraced the enduring dream of the Cuban people to live in freedom. My administration recently announced that we will not lift sanctions on the Cuban government until it makes fundamental reforms. We have also imposed tough, calibrated sanctions on the socialist Maduro regime in Venezuela, which has brought a once thriving nation to the brink of total collapse. The socialist dictatorship of Nicolas Maduro has inflicted terrible pain and suffering on the good people of that country. This corrupt regime destroyed a prosperous nation by imposing a failed ideology that has produced poverty and misery everywhere it has been tried. To make matters worse, Maduro has defied his own people, stealing power from their elected representatives to preserve his disastrous rule. The Venezuelan people are starving, and their country is collapsing. Their democratic institutions are being destroyed. This situation is completely unacceptable, and we cannot stand by and watch. As a responsible neighbor and friend, we and all others have a goal. That goal is to help them regain their freedom, recover their country, and restore their democracy. I would like to thank leaders in this room for condemning the regime and providing vital support to the Venezuelan people. The United States has taken important steps to hold the regime accountable. We are prepared to take further action if the government of Venezuela persists on its path to impose authoritarian rule on the Venezuelan people. We are fortunate to have incredibly strong and healthy trade relationships with many of the Latin American countries gathered here today. Our economic bond forms a critical foundation for advancing peace and prosperity for all of our people and all of our neighbors. I ask every country represented here today to be prepared to do more to address this very real crisis. We call for the full restoration of democracy and political freedoms in Venezuela. The problem in Venezuela is not that socialism has been poorly implemented, but that socialism has been faithfully implemented.
All right, there you have it, some of the highlights of the U.S. President's address at the UN General Assembly a short while ago. Just to close this segment, I'd like to ask all of my guests over here, starting with you, Mr. Vikri, if you had to sum up the U.S. President's speech over here, what are those 2 or 3 adjectives that come to mind?
I think that it was on message as opposed to a free-swinging, Twitter-laden approach, which is certainly an improvement. The other, though, is it's belligerent, that somehow the United States uses the big stick and these things are solved. He's completely forgotten about the carrot aspect. That is what you do positively.
Right. Interesting. Ramesh?
You know, I think there's an attempt by Trump to upend or revisit or rewrite the Obama legacy, be it in terms of climate change, Cuba, Iran, Obamacare domestically, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He's trying to revisit all the Obama legacy issues such as Iran or Cuba, and also add 2 of his own to the mix, Venezuela and North Korea. Now the question is, Obama came around and reopened talks with both Iran and Cuba. So my question, I'm thinking to myself at this moment in time, 4 years from now or 8 years from now, will Trump do another Obama by coming around to the view that talks and dialogue is the only way forward insofar as Venezuela and North Korea are concerned?
All right. And finally, Padma, how do you look at the U.S. President's address? How would you...
I think I saw a reinvented Trump. I think I'd like to talk about the 2 faces that he wears. The tone is, his tone was different. His tie was different. You know, from red tie, a fiery red tie and irresponsible rhetoric to the blue tie, you know, the cool blue of the United Nations. I thought that was very much of a statement. So I'd like to see more of the reinvented Trump, but certainly tone down the the sort of militant note that his speech took, and as Vikri was pointing out, and sometimes come up with those carrots as well.
Right. There's no denying that he's going to come up with an interesting tweet maybe a few minutes later, any time now. But on that note, thanks so much, Raymond Vikri, my colleagues Ramesh Ramachandran and, of course, Padma Rao for joining us with a perspective. That's it then on this edition of the broadcast. This is me, Sana Khan, signing off.